This is a pretty common story, this one. Late night alcohol-fuelled violence on the streets of Melbourne. Now, you might recall the Brumby government trialled a 2 a.m. lockout back in 2008. Sydney, I mean, it didn't work here, but Sydney have made a real fist of it, and the CEO of St Vincent's Health here reckons it's time we started to take our boozy problem seriously. Toby Hall joins me in the studio now. How are you, Toby?
Yeah, really good. Thanks, Tony.
That's good. Are you serious about this? A lockout is effectively a curfew, is it?
Absolutely. What we've seen in Sydney, I'm lucky I live in Melbourne, but I spend quite a bit of time in Sydney, and I've seen the difference between the two cities and particularly the impact on hospitals. And what's happened in Sydney in the last year is quite a profound difference to particularly the violent assaults related to alcohol. After some pretty horrendous situations just over a year and a half ago in Sydney, a lockout law was brought in, which basically is at 1:30 in the morning. The clubs don't let anyone else in, and people can drink till 3, and then it's last drinks at 3. Now, what that's done is it's restricted access to the venues, and it's meant people are staying in one venue, particularly later at night when the situation gets worse. Added to that, the other profound difference in Sydney is that the licensed outlets have to stop selling liquor at 10 o'clock, which is stop preloading. Now, the impact of this has been quite dramatic. So what we've seen in King's Cross, which was really in a pretty poor state beforehand, 36% reduction in violent assaults and alcohol-related assaults. In the CBD, we've seen a 26% reduction in violent assaults related to alcohol. Now, to give some context to that, in the last year, we've only had one alcohol presentation from the areas in the lockout laws in the hospital in Sydney. And in the previous year, we would have had one person a month going into ICU. That's quite a significant reduction. In fact, we had a specialist brain clinic established just to look after people after they were assaulted because of alcohol. That's been closed down because we don't need it anymore. Now, when you compare to Melbourne, what we've seen is about an 8% reduction in alcohol-related crime over the last 4 or 5 years.
A reduction. A
reduction. But what we've seen, interestingly enough, is on Swanston Street, at the same time, it now is at the high in the last 5 years for violent assaults. And so you can see in the inner city, whilst we've seen some reduction in crime overall, actually assaults are going up again in the inner city. And that's why we're saying, well, if they can get it to work in Sydney, why wouldn't we look at it here?
Okay, I'll say this. You've spent time in Sydney?
Yes.
I've spent a lot of time in Sydney, and I live in Melbourne, obviously. What works in Sydney does not necessarily work in Melbourne. We are only an hour apart by plane, but we are so opposed in our thinkings and our whole social fabric.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Different cities, different outlooks. This didn't just work in Sydney, though. It worked in Newcastle as well. Another city, totally different environment.
Still New South Wales.
It is New South Wales, and yet we can't always be nice to them. They do. They get a lot wrong, but they sometimes get things right. When you look at the impact of the changes, though, I don't think they can be ignored. And when you're looking at Swanston Street and you're starting to see an increase in assaults again, I think,
how much of an increase, though?
From what I understand, it's now at a 5-year high in terms of the increase.
Yeah, but you got numbers?
I haven't got the exact stats. They've only just come out from the police. And one of the problems in Victoria is we don't have good statistics. So we're just saying it's time to get in, review the laws again, and see if there's a better way for the inner city. And this is not about ruining fun. I love Melbourne. The nightlife's great here, but I think one of the things you've got to say to your listeners is how confident do they feel after they've been out in the city, walking down the street, walking home, because it's not always a pretty sight at night time.